Hi, my name is JacintheCôté, and my integrative activity is on Nicolae Ceausescu's authoritarian and communist regime, which took place in Romania between 1965 and 1989. I chose this topic because I really enjoyed reading Ruta Sepeti's I Must Betray You, which is the historical fiction taking place in Romania during this time period. I think that this topic is very relevant because some of the policies that were adopted during this regime still have some consequences on the lives of Romanians today. Additionally, some of those harsher policies which were enacted can help us to critically reflect on current political developments throughout the world. Without further ado, I will dive into some of the most pertinent historical, political, and sociological factors of this communist regime. Nicolae Ceausescu was born in 1918 to a family of peasants. He moved to Bucharest, Romania's capital, at 11 years old. During his teenage years, he became involved in the anti-fascist movement, which led him to be incarcerated multiple times. The image you see on the left is his famous mugshot, which was taken during one of his imprisonments. There, he met Gorgu Dej, which would become one of his mentors and which would teach him about Marxism-Leninism. Gorgu Dej actually became Romania's general secretary in 1947 as his Romanian Workers' Party was elected. From this point on, Romania became a satellite state of the Soviet Union. Rogudej put in a lot of efforts so that this East European country could industrialize itself and open its economy to the West, which is quite peculiar for a communist nation. During their political careers, Ceausescu and Gorgudej were called to work pretty closely. As a result, when Gorgudej died in 1965, Ceausescu became his successor. The man chose to continue the liberalization of the country. Romania even became the first communist country to welcome an American president on its territory, and this American president was Richard Nixon. However, Nicolae Ceausescu developed a cult of personality as he elevated his family members within the government through nepotism. His wife, Elena Ceausescu, was even deemed Romania's second most important person at the time. Not to mention that the new general secretary made any form of dissidence within the government impossible so that he could consolidate his power. One of the most intense policies which he enacted was the rural and urban systematization of Romania's lands. Following a major earthquake in 1977, which had some consequences on the capital of Bucharest, Ceausescu decided to completely raze the capital. In total, 40,000 buildings were destroyed so that socialist architecture could be used to rebuild the buildings. This had negative consequences on the quality of life of the citizens, however, because they were forced to live in tiny apartment buildings that were often devoid of running electricity, water, and even toilets. The new General Secretary built the House of the Republic at the same time, which became the second largest administrative building in the world after the American Pentagon. This goes to show that even though it took place in a communist country, there were still a lot of inequalities between the quality of life of those in power and the quality of life of the citizens who lived in those tiny apartment buildings. During the 1960s and 1970s, the exports to Western and Eastern countries, Romania's exports to Western and Eastern countries increased greatly. As a result, the country became a high growth economy. However, there was an oil shock in 1979 which completely undermined this economic growth. Ceausescu had to take on more and more debt, which led to the foreign debt increasing from 0.5 billion to 10.4 billion within only a few years. The communist leader decided to implement austerity measures which would allow him to pay back that debt. However, this led to a huge lack in domestic products that the citizens could consume. Even though participating in lines was just a typical trait of communist societies, this became even more frequent during the 1980s as stores were practically empty. There were almost no more domestic goods. Ceausescu's regime also had severe sociological consequences on the population. In 1966, he enacted pronatalist policies which aimed to increase the workforce of the country. Among those policies, there was the there was he made abortion illegal, and he made it much more difficult to import contraception into the country. As a result, 159 maternal deaths were recorded per 100,000 live births, which was the highest recorded figure in Europe. Because of the harsh austerity measures, families did not have the capacity to welcome more and more children. Thus, women had to go through unsafe abortions at home, or they had to give their newborn babies to poor orphanages and hospitals. Thousands of Romanian children were given to those institutions where they were not properly cared for, and that had huge consequences on their well being and on the development of their mental capacities. Another sociological consequences which I find very interesting was that Ceausescu's regime um, did not tolerate freedom of expression of Romanian artists. Its secret police was surveilling and threatening Romanian artists so that they could only put out artworks that reflected the regime's ideologies. The image you see on the right is notably a super positive portrayal of Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife. On the left, we can see a picture made by Rudolf Bone as he was showing how he felt when he was constantly censored by the government. Ultimately, there was an uprising in 1989 in the city of Timișoara as the citizens wanted to put an end to this dictatorship. Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu were executed on December 25. Sadly, this did not completely stop the consequences of their regime, since women continued to be distrustful of medical abortions, and a lot of children continued to be put into unsafe institutions for years. I performed a content analysis as my primary research. Essentially, I looked at 20 propaganda paintings which had been made by Romanian artists between 1965 and 1989. What I found was that the colors of the Romanian flag, which are blue, yellow, and red, were often portrayed into the paintings as a sign of nationalism. Additionally, signs of industrialization were often present into the artwork. For example, we could see trains or high buildings in the background. Another interesting fact is that Ceausescu was often represented with children around him. This could either symbolize his pronatalistic policies, or the fact that because he was such a great leader, children will come and want to be in his presence. Thus, um, those paintings were absolutely commissioned by the government and reflected how the communist leader wanted his population to perceive him. During my primary and secondary research, I found so many interesting information on the historical development of this communist regime, and I also found a lot of interesting policies that they enacted. However, there are still so many sociological and consequences that could be explored, since this party also um, discriminated against ethnic minorities like Hungarians. There's much more to discover on this topic. Thank you so much for listening to me.